I found out my parents hadn't abandoned me somewhere between the seatbelt sign dinging off and the jet engines settling into their steady roar. For 10 years, I told myself they left because I wasn't worth staying for. It turned out they'd been hiding for their lives, and somehow they thought that was the same thing as loving me. Welcome to Plot Twist Revolutions, where the stories you think you've already closed the book on get cracked wide open. Here, we don't just tell you what happened. We show you the moment everything you believed about your past becomes negotiable. I remember exactly where I was when the whole thing began to shift. Airplane. The low hum of the engines, the stale, recycled air, the faint clatter of carry-ons being forced into overhead bins. I squeezed into my cramped window seat, shoulders brushing against Ryan's, both of us trapped in that limbo between exhaustion and anticipation. We'd been friends since college, glued together by bad coffee, too many all-nighters, and a mutually questionable sense of humor. Sitting side by side on a red-eye flight to Seattle should have felt familiar. Two idiots chasing some half-formed version of closure. Instead, it felt like someone had tied a knot in my chest and left it there. "You ready for this?" Ryan asked, adjusting his glasses, that little cocky grin playing at the corner of his mouth. He always looked like he knew something I didn't, like life had handed him a spoiler, and he hadn't decided whether to share it yet. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said, rolling my eyes. "I just want to skip to the part where we're eating overpriced sushi at that place you love." He chuckled, leaning back, arms crossed. "You think your parents will actually come?" I shrugged, trying to act like it didn't matter. "It's been years since we really talked. I doubt they're interested. Just some awkward family reunion, you know." The truth was less polished. After I turned 18, they told me they were moving away for a new job. They said it like it was temporary, like they'd be back. But they didn't come back. Years passed. Then a decade. Calls went unanswered. Messages went nowhere. Birthdays became something I didn't bother marking on the calendar. They became ghosts with my last name. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, miming exits and oxygen masks like a ritual performance. I pretended to focus, nodding at the appropriate times, but the words slipped right past me. My fingers dug into the seatbelt buckle instead, marrow cold against my skin. What if they didn't show? What if I'd flown across the country just to stare at two empty chairs and finally get the answer I'd been too afraid to say out loud? "Hey," Ryan nudged me. "You okay? You seem a little tense." "Yeah, just thinking." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He didn't push, which was one of the reasons he was still in my life when so many others had blurred into the background. The plane lifted off, city lights shrinking into a scattered glow below us. I pressed my head against the window, watched the world drop away, and tried not to picture the cafe in Seattle where I might be walking into a second abandonment. Hours later, we landed. Seattle air hit different. Crisp. Damp. That faint electrical crackle that only cities with constant rain seem to have. As we shuffled off the plane, my heartbeat climbed higher, every step through the terminal echoing like I was walking toward a verdict. We grabbed our bags in silence. Outside, the night was cut into pieces by streetlights and neon signs. We ordered an Uber and slid into the back seat. Rain traced wandering paths down the windows as the driver pulled away. I watched the city blur past, Brick buildings, glowing storefronts, people huddled under umbrellas. And somewhere beneath the surface of my nerves, an old, stubborn anger flickered. They left. They chose to leave. They didn't call. They didn't come back. The cafe was small, tucked on a corner, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. The sign above the door glowed a soft gold. My fingers felt numb as I pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed, a bright, ordinary sound that felt completely wrong for the gravity of what I was walking into. I saw them before Ryan did. My parents. Sitting at a table against the wall, two mugs of something steaming between them, their hands folded in that awkward, too-still way people sit when they're waiting for bad news. For years, in my mind, they'd frozen in time at 30-something. Young. Sharp. Busy. The reality was jarring. They looked older. Softer. Lines etched into their faces like someone had taken a fine pen to their skin and traced every sleepless night, every suppressed word. But they were still them. My mother's hair pulled back, a few strands breaking free. My father's familiar slouch, the way he tapped his fingers on the table when he was anxious. "Chris," my mother exclaimed when she saw me, standing up so fast her chair almost toppled back. My father followed, a wide, tentative smile cutting across years of silence. "We thought you'd never come," he said. For a second the cafe went mute. The clink of spoons, the murmur of conversations, even the hiss of the espresso machine faded. They were alive. They were here. And everything I'd spent years mourning suddenly had a pulse again. "I didn't think you wanted to see me," I finally said, the words scraping out of a throat suddenly too tight. "You just left." My mother's eyes shimmered. My father looked down at the table, as if the wood grain might offer him a script. "We've tried to reach out," my mother said, voice trembling. "But there were complications. We didn't know how to explain." My jaw clenched. "What does that even mean? You walked out, no explanation, no goodbyes, just gone." Ryan shifted beside me, hands in his pockets, clearly wishing the floor would swallow him up. He'd signed up for emotional support, not a front-row seat to my family's implosion. "Can we sit down?" my father asked quietly. "Please, we owe you that much." I sat because my legs didn't seem to know what else to do. The coffee in front of me went cold untouched as they started to talk. Their story came out in pieces, like someone trying to explain a nightmare after waking up. Not smooth. Not rehearsed. Hesitant and messy. They hadn't left for a promotion. There had been no exciting relocation. There had been a scandal. My father's company had been under investigation. He'd been implicated in something he swore he didn't do. Financial misconduct, deals gone bad, names on papers they hadn't seen. Everything spiraled faster than they could control. "We couldn't put you through that," my mother said, fingers wrapped tight around her mug. "There were threats, rumors. We didn't know who to trust. We thought if you stayed out of it, out of sight, it would be safer for you. We had an arrangement with the authorities," my father added, voice low. "Lay low, stay away. No contact until it blew over. It was supposed to be temporary." "Temporary," I echoed, my voice cracking. "It's been 10 years. "I know," he whispered. "It lasted longer than anyone thought, and by the time it was over, we didn't know how to come back, how to explain why we'd stayed silent so long." The pride I'd built into a fortress around myself shuddered. For a decade, I'd told myself a simple story. They left. They didn't care enough to fight for me. I was better off without them. That story had kept me upright when birthday calls didn't come, when holidays were spent with friends' families or alone, when I signed leases and job contracts, and every line that required emergency contact was a reminder that my last name didn't come with backup. "You could have told me," I said, anger boiling up through the cracks of my composure. "You could have written a letter, an email, anything. Instead, I got nothing. Radio silence. You don't get to call that protection." "I know," my father said. There was no defensiveness in his voice now, just something fragile. "We told ourselves staying away was for your good, but the truth is, we were also ashamed. We didn't want you to see us like that, under investigation, questioned, treated like criminals." "There were so many times I wanted to reach out," my mother added, tears finally spilling over. "I'd pick up the phone, dial your number, and then hang up before it rang. I wrote letters I never sent. I kept thinking, we'll do it when things calm down, but it never felt like the right time." Silence settled over the table, like another layer of dust. I could feel people around us, other customers, sense the tension without knowing the words. It made my skin prickle. Ryan caught my eye, gave the smallest nod. Not pushing me. Not rescuing me. Just there. A quiet anchor. "So what now?" I asked. The question came out steadier than I felt. "You dumped 10 years of secrets on me, and then what? We pretend it didn't happen. We rewind." My father shook his head. "We can't pretend it didn't happen, and we can't fix it. All we can do is start from where we are." "Take it slow," my mother said. "If you'll let us get to know each other again, learn who you became, let you see who we are now." The unfairness of it all pressed hard against my ribs. I'd built an entire identity around being the kid whose parents walked out. I'd used that story to explain my walls, my distance, my reluctance to trust anyone too fully. If they hadn't abandoned me, if their silence had been, in their twisted way, an attempt to protect me, then who was I without that narrative? The anger didn't vanish. It stayed, raw and valid. But underneath it, something else surfaced. Grief. Not for losing them. For losing all the years in between. "That sounds fair," I said finally. The words tasted strange. Like speaking a truce into a war nobody formally declared. My mother's face softened, a flicker of hope lighting her features. My father exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath since I walked in. We talked. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. There were pauses where nobody knew what to say. Jokes that fell flat. Topics we circled around like they were too hot to touch. They asked what I'd studied. Where I worked. Whether I still played guitar. Whether I still added too much hot sauce to my food. I found out things too. Where they'd lived. Who'd helped them. The names of lawyers and agents and case numbers that had hung over their heads like storm clouds. Nothing about it erased what I'd gone through. But it chipped away at the certainty that they'd simply chosen to forget me. In the months that followed, we started to build something new. There were awkward dinners. We'd sit around a table that felt half familiar and half strange, filling the space with stories that tried to stretch a bridge across a decade-wide gap. My dad would tell a dumb joke, and then watch my face like he wasn't sure if he was still allowed to make me laugh. My mom would overcook the pasta the way she always had, apologizing, and I'd eat it anyway just to feel that old rhythm. We dug out old photos. I'd see myself at 5, at 9, at 14, frozen in moments they'd been there for. They pointed out the memories, the context, the little inside jokes I'd forgotten. Slowly, the story I'd been living with started to grow edges I'd never seen. It didn't become a happy fairy tale. We didn't hug it out and restore the past. But we found a way to stand in the same room with all that history and not drown in it. On another flight back to Seattle months later, I found myself in almost the same position as that first trip. Airplane seat. Ryan beside me. Engine hum. Only this time my chest wasn't a knotted fist. You realize you've basically speedrun a decade of therapy in like 6 months, right? Ryan said, smirking as he closed the tray table. I laughed. Really laughed. Can you believe it? I asked, staring at the clouds outside the window. A year ago, I was ready to die on the hill of they abandoned me. And now, he asked. And now, I exhaled. Now I'm starting to accept it's more complicated than that. They made awful choices. They hurt me. But they weren't just villains in my story. They were scared, ashamed, stupid, sure, but not heartless. He nodded. Talk about a plot twist. It's more than that, I said quietly. It's like all those years were chapters I thought were ripped out of the book. Turns out, they were just written in ink I hadn't seen yet. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the seat. Maybe some relationships aren't meant to be perfectly restored. Maybe they're meant to be acknowledged, rewritten, renegotiated. I used to think the only way to protect myself was to keep the story simple. They left. I survived. End of book. But life, it seems, doesn't care about clean narratives. Sometimes the people you cast as villains were trying, clumsily, disastrously, to be your shield. Sometimes they break you anyway. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to accept that both things can be true at once. They hurt me. They thought they were protecting me. They failed. They're trying again. The lesson wasn't that everything was forgivable. It was that I didn't have to stay frozen in the moment of impact. I could let the story keep going. As the plane started its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing weather conditions and arrival time, all the usual script. I tuned him out, thinking instead of my parents waiting at a café somewhere in the city. Two people who had once been my entire world. Two people I'd mourned as if they were dead while they sat, breathing under different skies. Now we were somewhere in between. Not strangers. Not the family we once were. Something new. Something fragile. Something that might, if we were lucky, become real. Maybe the real plot twist wasn't that they hadn't abandoned me. Maybe it was that I didn't have to keep abandoning the possibility of us. This is Plot Twist Revolutions. If you've ever lived a decade inside a story about why someone left you, only to find out the truth wasn't nearly as simple, then you know how hard it is to admit your pain and your narrative aren't the same thing. Some relationships are too toxic to resuscitate. Some doors need to stay closed. But some are worth at least cracking open, just enough to see if the person on the other side is still knocking. If this story made you think about someone from your past, a parent, a sibling, a friend you swore you were done with, tell your story in the comments. You don't have to forgive. You don't have to reconnect. But maybe you can let the story be a little more complicated than they left. I healed the end. Like the video if it hit closer than you expected. Subscribe if you want more stories where the truth doesn't erase the pain, but it does change what you do with it.